He's written for Civitas, an extended report on marriage and the importance of it is for social stability, and he'll no doubt refer to that as we're going along, but certainly check that out, I think, on the Civitas website. Just a couple of notices. I'll ask Daniel to speak for around 25 minutes to half an hour. He's got slides to share. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'll group them together and mediate them. We are keeping everyone's video cameras and microphones turned off for security reasons. This session is being recorded, so you can refer to it again on the Jubilee Centre website, or send it to people you think might be interested. Just a notice of our in-person gathering, the first we're trying since lockdowns and the disruption. It's planned for the afternoon of Friday, the 19th of September, and then the morning of Saturday, the 20th in Cambridge. It'll be in collaboration with Cambridge Papers, of which I'm a member of the executive board as well. And hopefully we'll have an interesting series of speakers for you on both Jubilee Centre and Cambridge Papers topics. So please put that in your diaries. The afternoon of Friday, 19th of September, and then morning of Saturday, the 20th in Cambridge. So with that said, I'll just pray for us and Daniel, and then I'll ask him to speak to us. Father God, we thank you for the model of marriage that you instituted through Christ and the church, that was the foundation of all human marriage. We thank you for the blessings of this institution. It saddens us to see how marriage is denigrated and treated lightly in our world. So we pray that you would give us wisdom as we think about how it can be strengthened and bless wider society, and also display the gospel more clearly. Pray now for Daniel that you'll be with him to speak clearly and wisely about this important topic. Amen. So Daniel, if you just want to introduce yourself and then take it away and share your slides.
Excellent. Excuse me. I'll start with sharing my screen. Is that now presenting for you, Paul? Is that
yes,
clear?
That's fine. That's
excellent. Great. Well, firstly, thank you very much indeed for having me. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about this topic here this evening. It's really important to me, and something I like to talk about. So it's a real honour. Just to give a brief introduction of who I am, which I think is helpful to understand sort of the context in which the report was written, and the sort of the arguments that are being made in this presentation. I did the Care Leadership Programme, which is a programme for young Christians interested in politics and public office 3 years ago, and worked with a think tank called Civitas during that, and then stayed on with Civitas for a few years. And then this year I moved to another think tank called the Centre for Social Justice, both sort of principally working in education policy, although education policy, as I will come to briefly, the answer tends to be that it is the stability of a family that a child grows up in, which is the keynote. So the overlap is immense between education and family policy. But the context of this presentation as a result is very much from working in the public sphere, working in policy making as a Christian. I attend with my wife St James and Giles Cross Church, if anyone knows it here, and members of the Students and Twenties group there. So there we are, Christians and churchgoers, but neither my wife or I have ever been theologically trained formally. So I'm not coming to this as a theologian, but a sort of policy wonk, if you will. Um, my presentation this evening sort of has four main parts to it. The first is that clicks. So bear with me. The first part is to go through briefly what the numbers tell for marriage rates, for what marriages look like, for when people get married, for how stable marriages are. The second is to make a secular, in inverted commas, case for marriage as a unique relationship. I say secular in inverted commas because the foundation of all of my arguments are Christ and the gospel. But I'll look to make the argument in a way that looks to satisfy the contemporary Western secular political dialogue, which so often is drenched in a Christianity that is not noticed or acknowledged. Third, I want to talk about why it matters that marriage is unique, why this is something that we shouldn't be indifferent about as Christians. And then finally, to talk about what can be done. And within this, to look at marriage both as a topic of public policy and to look at marriage as mission. I think too many Christians are uninterested in the public policy around marriage, and I think too many Christians working in Westminster that I know and love are too uninterested in the mission element of the question. So first, what story do the numbers tell in terms of marriage? The story is quite shocking, really. Marriage rates are not just down, they're down in a way that is completely unlike we've ever seen before. We have brilliant data from the ONS in the UK. We're really privileged with that, which means that we have an accurate sense of the marriage rate that goes back 150 years, actually 160 years, to the 1860s. And as you can see in the figure here and in the stats, there was quite profound volatility in the marriage rate over this time, particularly obviously during wars, as one would expect. But that volatility completely pales in comparison to the decline in marriage that we have seen in the last 50 years. We sort of that volatility was around 11%. So that would be, or I should say 1.1%. So that is the percentage of all unmarried women aged 16 or over that get married in a given year. And it has now fallen over 2% below that sort of minimum, or just under 2% below the minimum point for a total variation for 100 years of just that 1%. The second thing to note is that the decline has slowed. So we saw the fastest decline in the sort of 70s and 80s, but it hasn't stopped either. This is an ongoing trend. Lockdown slightly makes the numbers less clear, but we've seen this century pre-lockdown that it was still 2% a year was the decline year on year of marriage. So the overall story is quite something. And there are two elements to this principally. The first is that couples are delaying marriage, and the second is that fewer are marrying at all. I want to actually mostly focus on the fact that couples are delaying marriage, which I think is a more interesting observation. So again, the age at first marriage had been quite volatile for 100 years or so that we have in record, but has risen rapidly by a decade and 50 years since the 1970s. I think even more alarming, though, is about the sequencing. So if you go back to 1994, 41% of religious couples that self-report as being of a religion on national surveys, 41% lived together before they were married. That's 84% in the most recent estimates from a few years ago. We've seen a similar rise for non-religious couples, but that rise was 30 years earlier, and I think that's really worth being aware of. The third thing that the numbers tell, and I think it's the area that Christians often don't talk about, is that there is a massive poverty element to marriage. We see that more affluent, more highly educated, more likely to be employed individuals are much more likely to be in married relationships. The first point here on socioeconomic group is some evidence from Marriage Foundation, a brilliant think tank. The second from the Centre for Social Justice, and the third from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. who are obviously always a very sort of civilized and indifferent take on marriage, but they show that actually, if you look across an entire local authority, a 1% increase in the percentage of women within percentage of adult women within the whole local authority that have a degree increases the proportion of all births in that local authority that happened within a married relationship by 0.48%, which is really it both tells a story of affluence and marriage. It also tells a story of the feedback loop, the fact that people's behavior copies the behavior of those who they know and who they live around. So those are the headlines of what the numbers tell. To move to this secular case for marriage, I think the easiest way to understand how we can make the case for marriage in the public sphere, in that secular public sphere, based upon Christian values, but not just ignorant, but often actually actively opposed to them, is to look at the three most prevalent criticisms of marriage and to understand why they're baseless and illogical. So the first of those criticisms is that marriage is pointless, that it's the same thing as living together with your partner. It's just sort of a piece of paper. The second is that marriage is regressive, that it's outdated, it's backwards. Within this, you see many calling marriage sexist as well. And then the third is that it's illogical, that it's something that no sensible person would ever do because it's limiting, because it's final, because it restricts your freedom, and because it might be the wrong decision 20 years down the line. I think all of these are based on completely invalid assumptions, and I'm going to go through why I think we have a lot to say here. So first, marriage being pointless, and I think this is the most person. I think this is the one that I most often see as an argument, particularly around couples my age. Most of the couples I know that live together are not married, as someone in my mid-20s, and most would argue strongly this case, the marriage is pointless. I think there are three main ways that we can show that this is false. The first is that cohabiting relationships are not defined relationships. What they are is they're a defined residence of a relationship. So there are two criteria. You have to be a couple and you have to live together. But there is nothing within the cohabiting relationship about what you look like as a couple. It is only that you are a couple and that you live together. In a marriage, that's completely different. In a marriage, you have a defined relationship, and that relationship has been defined publicly in front of witnesses in a marriage ceremony. And that is, before going into what the definition looks like, the very fact that it is defined is crucially important because it takes away any information asymmetries and it takes away most power asymmetries as well. Because there's no sense if I didn't agree to that. And there's no sense of one is half in, half out waiting for options, and one is completely committed to the relationship. And these are consequential things, that power imbalance. Particularly you see it when relationships are under stress, or when there are accidental pregnancies, or when there are children involved in the main. Secondly, marriage is wholly shared, whereas cohabiting relationships are selectively shared. So by all means, you can agree informally to share everything. If you're in a cohabiting relationship, you can agree to share everything in your home. You can agree to share your home. You can agree to commit to making your decisions together. But none of these things are necessary. None of these things are formally done. These things are selected by the couple. And each time they're taken in their own terms, and a decision is made as to how best to proceed. In a marriage, that is structurally different. You make a commitment at the beginning of the marriage that your lives will be wholly shared. This has a massive impact on how you address challenges. I think most obviously you can see that when couples separate, because when a cohabiting relationship separates, by and large, what's one party's is one party's and what's the other's is the other's. And essentially you were joined because it was convenient and you just separate. Now, it can be massively, massively emotionally harmful and painful. And there are all sorts of very, very good reasons for that. But the lives in their entirety have not been joined in the same way. And thirdly, marriage is permanent, whilst cohabitations are indefinite. And I think the modern age conflates these two constantly. Indefinite is seen as permanent. If you have no intention to do otherwise, and you have no plan to do otherwise, and you have no set time that anything will expire, it is assumed to be essentially permanent. This is entirely false, and we can see this in one question, which is if you ceased to be interested in your partner, if you ceased to feel that you were attracted to them, or you ceased to feel that you loved them, what would you do? And that question has a huge emotional impact on the way that a relationship is set because you're not committed to making sure that whatever challenge you face, you will face it together and you'll get through it together. That is a structurally different type of relationship. And my hope is through all of these, I've not tried to necessarily, obviously I am biased. I have an opinion on this, but I think those three distinctions are inarguable whether one thinks cohabitation or marriage is a better relationship structure. Secondly, and I'll be much quicker with the next two because I think although important, I think they are less fundamental than that first point. Secondly, marriage is not regressive in any logical sense of the words. Um, we talk about marriage being regressive when we hear it in Westminster, mostly around female empowerment. That's normally what it is referencing. But partial indefinite commitment is uneven. And generally speaking, and the data draws this out, it's roughly 2 to 1, that if a couple is surveyed and one party thinks that they are committed permanently and the other doesn't, in 2 out of 3 cases, the party that thinks they are not committed permanently will be the man. That will be the individual who thinks that they can leave when they please, whilst the woman sees it as permanent. And especially in terms of vulnerability with children, to move on to the second point, marriage publicly and legally protects this because you have made a commitment to friends and family, to witnesses in a social event, that institution of marriage, that ceremony. And you have legal protections that follow that. The legal protections are a consequence of, not a cause of, but they're a consequence of that. That mean that you are protected if there is, if for example, the man in a relationship were to leave when things became difficult with a child. Thirdly, and just to touch on very briefly, people often talk of marriage as sexist because of the traditions of weddings being things that they find unsavory. Things like brides being given away, or things like you may now kiss the brides, or things like the speeches in a typical wedding breakfast being the father of the bride, and then the groom, and then the best man, all male, or things like the bride wearing white, which is often associated culturally with virginity, although actually it was initiated by Queen Victoria, who was symbolizing wealth. So it's historically inaccurate, but traditionally it holds potence. And all of these things, some love these traditions, some don't love them at all. But they are not the marriage union. And it is not valid to criticize the union of marriage as regressive on the basis of having issue with those traditions, because those traditions are entirely optional. Those traditions need not be done in a wedding. The reason why they are done is because people like them and actively want to do them, which is an interesting conversation in its own right, but not the focus of this presentation. Thirdly, marriage is not illogical. It is simply a product of this culture that we view it as such. We have a very specific cultural perception of freedom in the UK at the moment. I think that shouldn't be too controversial to say, but I will explain myself without just leaving it as a hanging statement. Our perception of freedom, I think this was clear in the assisted suicide debate we saw recently. I think it's clear in the way we speak about marriage as well. We view freedom as autonomy. We view freedom as not being stopped from doing things and not having people dictate the way we behave. Within that, we then view freedom as a sliding scale because it is the amount that you are constricted from behaving as you would like to behave. That's not how freedom works, because freedom is as often a freedom to use the phrase, as it is as a freedom from. In marriage, you gain freedoms as well. You do lose freedoms. You lose the freedom to start dating a different partner, and you lose the freedom to pull out because things have got tricky. But you gain the freedom to know that your spouse is committed to you, whatever the future holds. You gain the freedom of knowing that you will be addressing these things as two, not one. And that understanding of freedom completely changes the logic of the decision. It's no longer a reduction of freedom, it's a trade-off of freedom. It's a different type of adventure. It's a different way of living life, but it is not any less free. It is simply free in a different way. I'll return to that point. Second, and I'll only touch on this briefly, the fear of finality is not logical. The fear of finality comes from a worldview that deifies the self and the present. It is not the logical conclusion. If we talk of logic as God's order for the world, finality, this life is the opening scene, it's the prologue. And I think we should quite strongly reject as Christians, absolutely weighty decisions should be made in a way that respects the weight of them. But finality is not something that is necessarily problematic. Finality is simply something that demands thought and demands real discernment. And that moral distinction is one that I think is important to make when we talk of the logic of the marriage decision. So, what are the numbers? We see the rapid decline and the uneven decline. Why is marriage different? We see that it has a clear and distinct purpose to cohabitation. We see that it is not a regressive form of relationship, and we see that it is not illogical in the sense that it is argued to be. Why does this matter? I'm going to focus mostly on the sort of the public policy end, if you will, of why this matters. There is a strong theological case to be made for why this matters, but I want to stick to the day job in this to make the argument in these terms, partly because I think it's where Christians are often have the least tools to explain the point. Principally, it matters because marriages are far more stable than any other relationship. To put it in sort of Christian layman's terms, because God's right about how we should do relationships, and because of common grace, we see that in both non-Christian and Christian couples. The data consistently shows, and so many have tried to prove this wrong, and they have all failed, that marriage impacts relationship stability more than every other factor, more than the factors that are often seen to impact relationship stability the most, such as income, type of job, and education level. We've seen there are several studies, far too many to list here, that have shown that if you take, it's hard to measure the breakup of cohabiting couples because they never formally bond, but you can look at birth registrations and how couples define themselves when a child was born. And we can see that in the early years of a child's life, and actually their entire childhoods, cohabiting couples are between 2 and 4 times as likely to separate as married couples are. And those numbers, some of those studies, there are several studies within that. Some of them control for other factors, some don't. But the 2 to 4 holds. It's nearer 2 for those that control, of course. But this is a large body of evidence. Much of it across Europe, some of it German, some of it British, some of it American. But it all tells the same story. There is also a growing body of evidence, much less so in the UK, and that's something that must be resolved. But there's a growing evidence that stable families are fundamental to the life outcomes of parents and children. We did some interesting stuff recently on loneliness. Married people and children of married people are both much less likely to be lonely than their counterparts. But there are a host of other factors as well where we see this. Secondly, it matters because of the poverty element, as mentioned earlier, which is that unstable families is a crucial element of this intergenerational instability feedback loop for families, where we see that growing up in an unmarried household makes you more likely to experience separation and family breakdown. It also makes you less likely to see role models and people who have modeled to you the way to live in a healthy relationship, which means that A, you're much less likely to have healthy outcomes in the main because you've not had that stable childhood. But B, you're much less likely to form stable relationships. You're much likely to trust them as valuable because you've not seen them, and you're much likely to do them yourself, which then means that your children are disproportionately likely, even more so than they were before, to grow up in the same context you did. And you see the trend compound itself in both directions. If children see the value of healthy marriages, then they are more likely to marry. I mean, you often joke that you often see in the evangelical church this extraordinary surge of young adults getting married in their 20s and 30s because they've seen how much of God's common grace is shown in marriage, and they yearn for it. Whereas you see this desert of marriage among young adults across the country. That leads to an increasing gap. And that gap we see so much in poverty data and so much in worklessness data that family stability is a cornerstone of this. So as Christians who care for looking after the poor and care for the lonely and the vulnerable, family is a crucial, and marriage in particular is a crucial element of this. So what can be done? And I'm slowly coming towards the end for those. Thanks very much for being so patient with me. I think there are two parts of this story. There's the question of what can be done in the policy space, and there's the question of what can be done in terms of mission. I'm going to focus on three policy areas first. The first is something that shouldn't be done, but something that I think is extremely dangerous and highly likely, and something that we should both pray does not happen and lobby as best we can does not happen, which is the introduction of so-called cohabiting rights. It's essentially, to use sort of the language that might be more familiar to the room, common law marriage. Essentially, that if you live together for 2 years or longer as an unmarried couple, that you are therefore de facto married, and you are given, without seeking them, you are given all of the rights and responsibilities, or at least most of the rights and responsibilities that a married couple would have. You get all the legal elements of the commitment without any of the principles and actual commitments and concepts and decision making and bonding to one another that the legal elements are a consequence of. You try and protect the mother or the father as best you can without any appreciation or understanding of why the protection is in place and what it is symbolizing in terms of what that relationship is. I think this would potentially be the final blow to secular marriage and to marriage within the country. And I think it's something that we must try and contest as best we can. Second, and it's always a slightly tedious point when policymakers say it, but we need to talk in the public sphere more about the importance of marriage as Christians, and we need to be less sort of icky about it. It's a joyful thing, marriage, and it's a beautiful thing. And it's a place where we see so much sacrificial love. We see so much of the sort of the fulfillment that those who are not Christian yearn for in themselves. And we also see such a key element of fighting poverty in this country. And we need to prove that to political leaders. People like me need to arm Christians with the data, but then Christians need to go and speak of it. And we need to try and find political leaders, Danny Kruger comes to mind, to speak boldly about the value of this. Third, we need to remove the literal cost barrier to weddings. Weddings in the UK are estimated by wedding magazines to cost between sort of £20,000 and £25,000. Of course, those who love sampling will know that there's a massive selectivity bias in that, because those who are doing the survey are those who like extravagant weddings, because they're those who buy wedding magazines. But even data that tries to control for that finds that just due to regulatory barriers around the fact that weddings are organized around the venue, weddings are almost always at least £5,000, normally £10,000, even if you are being careful with your cost. And we go into detail of that in the report. It's very hard to have a wedding cheaper than that, because the law is designed around the place. And it was designed in that way because of the assumption that most people would be getting married in their Anglican church, in their parish. That was a joyful assumption, and a time that we can hope to return to. But now what it does is it creates a large cost barrier for the 83% of marriages that happen outside of churches to happen. And it means that common grace of that bonding to one another that couples can have is massively reduced because couples can't afford to wed. It's the second most common reason why couples aged 18 to 35 have not married. Behind they don't want to, the second most common is because they can't afford it. And that is a barrier that can be very easily reduced. And we know this because the way the law is set up in Australia, in the United States, In the other constituent parts of the United Kingdom, other than England and Wales, in Jersey, in Guernsey, is organised around the officiant as opposed to be organised around the venue. Uh, Essentially, the rest of the law stays the same. Um, it doesn't largely impact any of the process, but it means that a venue does not need to get the status that costs a huge amount of money to therefore be able to host weddings. And that barrier to entry in the market is taken away. So it's no longer just hotels and stately homes and the odd barn that can host a wedding, and it becomes every village hall that can host a wedding. And it's organized around the officiant, which is also a much better proxy of the seriousness of the occasion. It is who is doing this ceremony, much less so than how pretty is the building that it happens to be in. But of course, all of these things, although important, and although I think really worth fighting for as Christians, these are tweaks, these are legal tweaks to try and improve the context in which people make decisions. This won't move the hearts and minds of those making the decisions. And here the question comes back to mission, which is how, as Christians, can we share the gospel of Christ and therefore improve relationship formation and the way that we relate to one another and bond with one another as human beings through sharing the gospel. And forgive my slightly clunky flowchart here, but I wanted to explain the chain of reasoning as to why I think that there is a clear link between the importance of marriage as a social institution and sharing the love of Jesus Christ to those that we know in our lives. Because so much of why people oppose marriage is because it is a restriction on autonomy. It lies in contrast to the self-actualization of a life where you deify your best self, and that is how you take your value, is the striving to get as close to your best self as you can. Whereas in marriage, you are saying actually a fundamental component of how I live my life is in my love for another person, my sacrificial love in a relationship for another human being. And that is to move away from the worship of self and towards the worship of sacrificial love. And ultimately, it's towards the worship of Jesus Christ. If we model healthy marriages where husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church, and where wives submit to their husbands, if we model that, and we model in church family life that same relationship, where we are mutually sacrificially loving to each other, we welcome, we share what we have with them, we give, we have them in our home. We point people to Jesus. And if we point people to Jesus and we do it with our entire lives, we will also share with them that sacrificial family life, and we will model to them healthy marriages because we are looking to Jesus as we are doing it. And I think ultimately, if we are to move the dial structurally on marriage, if we are to really change the cultural view of marriage, we have to move from a culture focused on the self to a culture focused on Christ. That brings me to the end of my presentation on this report, Marriage in a Stable Society. Thanks very much for listening, and I welcome all comments, questions, queries, points of disagreement. It'd be great to hear it all.
Thank you, Daniel. If you'd like to stop showing your screen, and then we'll take questions and comments. If you can put any reactions or questions in the Q&A in the chat, then I can sort of group them together. I'll start with one for Daniel in terms of talking to wider society and popular approaches to marriage, perhaps more so in America than here. Is there any evidence on the benefits of prenuptial agreements and whether that makes marriage more stable or less stable?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I will confess to not knowing the American data nearly as well as I know the British data, and the British data. Prenuptial agreements are much less common in the United Kingdom than they are in America, which means you have a much smaller sample, which means it's much more harder to argue statistically whether or not they make a relationship more or less likely to break down. they're also far more common among affluent, educated couples than they are among less affluent, less educated couples. And affluent marriages are slightly more likely to stay together, which means that you have a confounding factor bias in your data as well. Um, to my understanding, and I should clarify, I don't know the data well, prenuptial agreements have a slight positive impact on relationship stability, probably, but one that is not always statistically significant when controlling for other factors. So I guess that's a pretentious way of saying that the data is not clear. In terms of sort of my moral view, as it were, on prenuptial agreements, I confess to being no expert at all and to having not thought about it in great detail. But I would instinctively say that it does something to erode the permanence of a marriage and the agreement to be together forever, whatever. But at the same time, I can see how it enforces the legal protections. But I would probably lean more towards the former.
Thank you. We're getting a couple of questions or comments in. First from Andrew. Would you like to comment on why there's so much resistance to this data, presumably the link between stable marriage and poverty, education outcomes, and so on? Why is it so unpopular with the sort of secular political discourse?
Yeah, a question I think about all the. Am I too loud now? I've moved my microphone, by the way. Am I okay?
Well,
But
we had a couple of comments that you were dropping off, and I think I'm fine. I've been told I've got to speak up
okay,
now,
I'll
so
continue.
I'll try and shout, but you continue.
So this is a question I think about all the time because we're constantly looking at how there's a constant sort of trade-off you're trying to think about when you're trying to argue things you think are important but are unpopular in public policy, which is that you want to win the room, but you also want to defend what is true and right. And we're sort of constantly thinking about why is there so much resistance to the data of marriage? Because there is a tremendous amount. Um, I think that there are principally two reasons. The first, yeah, as I sort of talked about throughout, is because when autonomy is the key element of what people value politically, and we could talk for a huge amount about why that is and what exactly I mean by that. But to leave it in those slightly vague terms, being told what to do is then extremely unattractive politically. And marriage, because it is a major life decision, it always feels to people as though they're being told what to do. And that always means it is something that people have aversion to. And that also means it's always something that politicians, whose job essentially is to be popular, um, or at least for many, that is how they view their job, are going to be nervous to do. The second reason why I think there's so much resistance to this data, alongside that sort of that love of autonomy, is because it it seems judgmental towards those who have very complicated circumstances, and it seems uncompassionate to those who, through no fault of their own, are in very difficult circumstances. And I think that's something we should be much more sensitive to as Christians and much more nervous about. Well, not nervous about, but nuanced about and loving about, and with an attitude of listening, as opposed to an attitude of instructing. So I suppose to sort of put it broadly, I think there's a harmful reason, and I think there's a legitimate reason, which is that you know the case study so often used. I mean, it's extremely uncommon, but so often used of a wife remaining in an abusive marriage. It, that is something that is hugely pastorally sensitive and should be taken extremely seriously. And we do need to be sensitive to that when we talk about marriage. Anyway, those would be my two sort of main things I see.
Thank you. I think the next question is around the difficulty for Christians in promoting the idea of marriage, but then obviously the secular introduction of same-sex marriage and perhaps pressure to have more than two people in a marriage arrangement. How can we both be promoting marriage, but then saying, no, there are boundaries on certain marriages that we don't want to see?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I sort of I guess to agree with Tim, I think there was a really interesting I think it's really interesting as a case study that it was Cameron's Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition that introduced same-sex marriage, which was a sort of a coalition built on actively promoting the big society, actively promoting the importance of marriage in many speeches, introducing the marriage allowance as a policy in 2013. That was the political context in which the government introduced same-sex marriage, and I think that's important to note because same-sex marriage within secular terms, political secular terms, can be viewed as saying, if you're in a committed long-term relationship where you live together, you should make that relationship permanent and wholly shared and publicly defined because that is a healthier way to do a relationship. And actually, I think the logic of that is fully sound and a logic that I sort of as a socially conservative instinct would entirely agree with. As a Christian, I would say it's a really good example of the danger of when we talk about cultural Christianity and politics, and we talk about sort of conflating social conservatism with Christianity, because I think on cultural Christian and socially conservative grounds, same-sex marriage is an extremely beneficial update to the legal process. But on Christian grounds, where we see the way that God describes marriage in the Bible through Paul, and we see the way that it is discussed, and the way that we see the relationship between father and son in marriage, and the way we see marriage as the place for having children, I think we see something that is of a value far and a mystery far beyond that secular conservative cultural Christian logic that we can work within. There's so much more to it. It's a good example where I think actually you can politically agree, but there can just be so much less to the secular logic. And if there's less to something, it will often land in the wrong place, even if all the steps it does make sense.
Thanks. We then got a question about the impact of divorce, and are divorced people more or less likely to divorce again second time around what's it's like of the stability of their second marriage? And maybe in light of the previous question, I don't know whether you could comment on the data. I haven't followed them up recently. What the divorce rates are like for same-sex marriages relative to one man, one woman marriages.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I should just note as a footnote, so you do check my numbers. It's all in the divorces in England and Wales data on the ONS. The public data is very high quality, and then you can go into sort of understanding society if you want the proper sort of deep level data. So, firstly, on couples that have been divorced and then got married again. So, all that we have in the public data is second marriages. We don't know if they were widowed or if they were divorced in those second marriages. What we do have is that they are more likely each year of their relationship to separate, but they are less likely in the main to separate. So they're more likely to stay until they die in the relationship, until death do them part, but they are more likely each year to separate. And that is because the more previous marriages the person has, the more likely they are to be older on average, basically, which means that the data is massively skewed because the length of time between wedding ceremony and expected death is shorter. Slightly sort of morbid statistics, but so you see essentially year on year that they're it's actually relatively minimal, but they're slightly less secure year on year. But then in terms of the life of the relationship, they are more secure. In terms of same-sex marriage relationship stability, the thing with looking at marriage stability is that there is a huge time lag because it's often as much as 50 or 60 or 70 years even between a couple getting married and actually being able to verify whether their relationship ended in divorce, because one party has to die to know it didn't, which means that generally how we measure divorce likelihood is we take the first 5 or 10 or 15 years and we look at the shape of the curve, and then we extrapolate it by looking at the shape of the curve for every other year that has ever been. And then you can learn from the shape what you expect to happen. The interesting thing with same-sex couples, particularly actually marriages with two women, is that the rates are slightly higher. Obviously, it's been less long, so we don't know a lot. The rates are slightly higher, but the shape's very different. So as in it's less of a sort of S curve, if you can picture that. Um, and it's more of a sort of classic upside down U curve, if you will. And that means it's almost impossible to extrapolate accurately because we see that the sort of the structural year on year impact seems to have a slightly different shape. Now, one can speculate by saying, well, it's a bit higher after 5, so it's presumably going to be that same rough amount higher after 20. But it's sort of it would be slightly statistically reckless is too strong. But sorry, that's a very long way of saying we're not sure.
Thanks. The final question we've got in the chat is somewhat complicated, and I'm not sure I can summarize it from William Habib Steele. It's about Scottish marriages and the differences that had been legislated for. I don't know if you can work through that or you're familiar with Scottish marriage law from previous decades.
Yes, just reading through that. I don't know the history of Scottish marriage law very well. I can't so I suppose I can't provide sort of much more information than William has on the detail of that. Um, I suppose the one comment I would make on marriage law in general, and this is somewhat tangential, but I think there is a relation, particularly in terms of when we talk about the legalities around wedding ceremonies, is that most, I mean, sort of there have been several bills made in subsequently that have slightly edited it, but most of the main legislation upon which weddings law is designed in England and Wales was written in the 18th and 19th century, and it was written around these sort of founding assumptions that people would generally live and die in the same parish. They would generally attend their parish church as Anglicans. They would generally marry someone from the same parish. And those three assumptions, which were largely true, meant that the law only really was designed around weddings of that form. And all other type of weddings has essentially been bolted onto the law as the years and decades of centuries have gone by, which means the law looks slightly different for a Jewish wedding. It looks slightly different for a Christian but non-Anglican wedding. It looks slightly different for a non-religious wedding. And you end up with all sorts of slightly odd inconsistencies and quirks and weird, oh no, you're in this bit of the law and not in this bit. One particular case in point that I think is really striking is that you are not allowed to have components of more than one type of wedding in a wedding ceremony. So if you have a civil marriage, which is a sort of non-religious marriage, you're not allowed a hymn or a Bible reading because you're not a Christian marriage. You're not in that bit of the law, which I think is sort of strongly opposed to sort of pluralist conception of society. It's also just legally odd that it's designed that way. So I think the one thing that William really accurately highlights here, which is really helpful, is that I think there is a conservative case for updating the law. It is not a sort of let's have a sort of progressive new design of weddings law. It's to say actually no, this is now just looking poorly designed. It's like a house with too many extensions because it has been bolted on in the way it has.
I've been told I can't be heard, so I'm going to take the headphones off.
To try and speak through my microphone. I hope that's better. I don't think we've got an actual question or comment. There's just an aside that had come through from John Wibberley. I suppose my final question for you, Daniel, would be, has there been much of an impact yet on the longevity of marriage from the introduction of no-fault divorces? Obviously, Christians were concerned about that introduction and in a sense made exit easier from the marriage contract. Has that had any noticeable impact?
Yeah, I think a really important question to think about. That we don't know much of the numbers yet, and lockdown made it particularly hard to evaluate because everything got sort of messed up, both statistically and socially. The thing that we can see very clearly is that we can look at the timing of what happened when marriage started to decline rapidly. So the marriage rate peaked in 1971 or two, I think it was 1972. And that was the highest it had ever been on record. It had risen through the 60s and the 70s just slightly. And since then, it has rapidly declined, particularly from sort of 72 to 92. There was this extraordinary decline from the highest ever to the lowest ever comfortably within 20 years. And that immediately succeeded two major legal changes brought in by the Wilson government of the time. The first was the Abortion Act, and the second was the Divorce Reform Act. And both of those were large social liberalizations of the law, moving towards autonomy as the principal moral framework for family law. Now, of course, to draw causation there is very difficult. But I think what I would say is that structural changes in the law like that tend to follow social changes. It tends to be a reaction to social changes, partly because politicians are trying to gain popularity through showing that they are listening to the social change, right? Part of that process is there. And I think what one can say there is that there was a social change followed by a legal change, followed by a massive acceleration of the social change. And I wonder whether we will see with no fault divorce a similar thing, where you have a social change around we must not criticize the separation of a married couple because therapeutically it might be the best thing for them. It probably is. Therefore, we must remove legally any element of blame from the process, because this need not be a thing where there is any element of blame, because it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just one of those things. Life happens. It's very difficult. At which point, so that there's an insensitive way to frame it, but sort of, I hope my basic point is clear. At which point you then accelerate that change. And the final thing I will say on that, and sorry for the long answer, is that actually the one silver lining that we have seen from the tremendous decline in the marriage rate that has been so shocking in the last 50 years is that actually marriages are much more stable than they were 30 or 40 years ago. They were about the least stable they'd ever been in sort of the early 90s, and since then they're becoming much more stable. And we now actually historically have relatively historically stable marriages in the UK, partly because the only people marrying now really want to. And that does make me think that the impact of no-fault divorce will be muted, because it will probably only be pertinent for those who married in a social context where that was the typical thing to do, as opposed to those marrying now, if that follows logically. So I hope it won't. I fear that it will have a substantial impact, but I hope that there's a chance it might not.
Thank you. Well, I think yes, John has just put a comment on, but I don't think that was a question. So I think we've exhausted the questions and my questions. So remains to me to thank Daniel for the presentation. Can I repeat, go to the Civitas website to find his longer sort of 100-page report on marriage and societal stability. Well worth reading. There is a sort of shorter version he did for us on the Jubilee Centre website, so please look at that. Also look at Marriage Foundation website. They span off from the Jubilee Centre many years ago, so we have common heritage, but please go and support Marriage Foundation as well. And just to repeat the notice I gave at the beginning, if you're interested in a face-to-face meeting with myself, Michael Schluter, others on both the Cambridge Papers and the Jubilee Centre boards, then please come along to Cambridge 19th and 20th of September, afternoon of the 19th, morning of the 20th. Please email Ruben for the details, and he'll register you if you're interested in coming to that. Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Much appreciated, and the comments in the chat are also thanking you. So,
thanks so much for having me. It's been great fun.
We'll not sure we haven't got another webinar in the diary yet, but we'll keep you informed as to when we'll be hosting another one. Thank you very much.